So welcome everybody to what I believe is the fourth workshop in our seedlings series. We want to welcome you tonight. We're so happy you could join us. My name is Amy Fontaine and I am the library supervisor of the Rochambeau Library at Providence Community Library. My colleagues and co-organizers of the seedlings series are here as well. Lee Smith, who's the adult services librarian at Providence Community Library's Mount Pleasant location, and Fatima Massoud, an ecological landscape designer, educator, and artist. And we also would like to thank our collaborators on this project, Vanessa Venturini and the URI Master Gardeners Program, and also Summer Gonzalez of the Brown University Superfund Research Program. As we begin this event, we acknowledge that we are presenting from Providence, Rhode Island, a small portion of the traditional homelands of the Narragansett and Wampanoag peoples. Collectively, we support the return of Indigenous seeds to their rightful stewards. So Amira Mitchell is a farmer, seed keeper, horticulturist, and community educator who is joining us tonight to talk about the importance of seed keeping. Amira holds a BS in horticulture from Temple University and has worked in agriculture since 2007. She has worked on urban farms in Massachusetts, Georgia, and Pennsylvania, including 4 years at True Love Seeds, a Philadelphia-based farm and seed company. Amira recently crowdfunded over $27,000 in donations to start the Black heirloom seed farm, Sista Seeds, growing heirloom seeds from her own heritage and from across the African diaspora. As always, our presenters are happy to take your questions after their presentation is done. We will allow people to be unmuted to ask their own questions, but feel free to type your questions into the chat in the moment that they arise so that you don't forget once you have the opportunity to ask it. Closed captioning is available if you click the button at the bottom of your Zoom window. And right now, I'm just going to turn it over to Fatima to say a few words about the Providence Seed Library.
Hi, everyone. I'm just going to take a couple of minutes of your time to introduce the Seed Library, and then we'll go on to Amira's presentation. So can everyone see that? Cool. So you might have seen this before if you have been to earlier presentations, but this is just like 4 minutes of your time to introduce this project. So the Providence Seed Library is, sorry, trying to get my screen to cooperate with me. There we go. So the Providence Seed Library is a resource for free, open pollinated, heirloom, and culturally relevant seeds. It's part of a collaboration that's been going for about a year with Providence Community Libraries, and I'm really grateful that I've been able to work with the library system and have their support on this project. And seeds from the library can be borrowed from the collection, and they can be returned at the end of the following growing season. And you can also donate varieties that perhaps are not yet in the collection. And if you're interested in seeing what seeds are available or learning a little bit more about it, you can check out provseedlib.com, and you can also go to the Instagram, which is @provseedlib. So I'm going to show you how to navigate to the catalog so you can see what's available. So if you were to go to provseedlib.com, you would come to a page that looks like this. And if you were to click on this yellow link at the bottom of the screen, it would bring you to the Ocean State Library's online catalog. So first, it's kind of amazing that we have this. The fact that the online catalog exists is the result of a huge amount of work from several librarians, but in particular, Gail Yaluk, who's the systems coordinator, who like masterminded this amazing system to track everything. So when you first enter the catalog, you'll be at a screen, which is what you see on the left of your screen right now, is the first page you navigate to, and that has subcategories of different plants that are available. If you click on one of those subcategories, you'll come to what you see on the right, which shows the specific seed varieties, what library branch they live at, and whether or not they're available. The status of whether they're available or not isn't always accurate because not everyone has been checking out the seeds, but I think no one has been very strict about that because the goal is just for seeds to get in the hands of people who are interested in growing them. but we do still have some data from, tracking what people are really excited about growing each year or in the first year. If you took out packets in the first year, if you go to a library branch now, the ones that are still available would have a packet that looks like the one you see on the left. So it would have the common name of the plant. It also has the botanical or scientific name, which is the name in Latin. It has the source of the seed. So that might be an individual grower or it might be a seed company. And it has what I've termed seed saving difficulty. So that's definitely not an exact science, but it kind of refers to a seed's tendency to cross-pollinate, or if there are things you need to keep in mind as a gardener, if you want to grow a seed and have it produce a plant with the same characteristics in the following year. So a plant that has an easy seed-saving difficulty might be something like a pea that typically self-pollinates. And something that is complicated might be, or that would be labeled as difficult, might be something like corn, where you would have to be mindful of things like pollination times or isolation distance. So that's not to deter anyone, but just to give people a sense of what they're getting into if they want to save those seeds. And then the image on the right, I'll explain in the following slide. So you can always donate seeds. Let's say you've purchased some seeds that are organic seeds and you want to donate them to the library. You're welcome to do that, as long as the packet is somehow sealed so that it doesn't, make a mess. But if you have seeds from your own garden that you'd like to donate to the library, I ask that you try to label them with the following information. So, and please bring it to the library in a sealed paper envelope, and you can bring it to different Providence Community Library branches. So the first piece of information would be the common name. So it could be the name that you know the plant best by. So the example here is painted pony bean. And I've also included the example of cempasúchil, which is an indigenous name of a plant that's also known as marigold. So if you know a plant by its indigenous name or by name in your own language, and you're able, to label it with that, it's really important and valuable to have that information and try to catalog it. And I know not everyone's crazy about this, but if you can include the scientific name as well, which is something that you can find on seed packets, or it's something you can Google. If you can include that information, it's okay, but if you can, it's really great to have. If you want to stay connected to the seed library, including contact info, is totally optional, but also a cool thing to have. And then also information about where you grew it, the year you collected the seeds from however many plants. So you could say it's seeds from 1 sunflower or seeds from 20 okra pods. And that's not necessary information, but also information that continues, if someone really wants to know a lot about the characteristics of plants you're growing from, or is wanting to learn more about seed selection or adaptation, those are things that are interesting to know, but it's not necessary. And you can also include whether the plant is annual, meaning you plant it from seed each year, or if it's perennial, so it regrows from roots each year. I have a few seed return guidelines. These are not comprehensive in any way, but I ask that folks don't donate hybrid seeds or seeds saved from hybrid plants. There's nothing wrong with hybridization. It's like an age-old process, and there are amazing things that are hybrids, but for the purposes of this seed library, one of the goals is that people be able to save the seeds 1 year to the next and get, somewhat consistent characteristics. So hybridized seeds sometimes mean that if you plant the next generation, you might not get the characteristics you're expecting. If you have questions about that, please ask in the chat. Please do not donate patented or genetically modified seed. You're not coming across that as often, or very often, but it's worth noting. And please don't donate seed that has not been dried or seed that is moldy. And you can bring the seeds to Knight Memorial, Mount Pleasant, Washington Park, or Rochambeau branches of Providence Community Libraries. And the system's really interconnected. So if you bring it to the library branch that's closest to you, it'll get in the right hands. And then just very quickly, some simple seed borrowing guidelines are: 1, Please take only as many seeds as you need and try not to take all the seeds of a particular variety. If you borrow seeds, consider returning seeds to the collection the following year if you feel able to do that. When you take seeds out of the library, think about your cultural relationship to the plants you will grow. If you intend to save seeds, consider the seed saving difficulty and your experience level as a gardener, which I ask just so if you're returning seeds to the library, it's you're attempting to return seeds that are of like good quality to future growers. And this is like a kind of a collective teaching tool and experiment. So I hope that trying this is a way that we all learn and grow our knowledge together. If you are interested in getting involved with the seed library, if you have questions, if you just want to be in touch, you can feel free to email me at hello@provseedlib.com. You can check out the collection at provseedlib.com. And you can also follow the Instagram, which I'm really bad at updating, but maybe someday I'll be good at it, at provseedlib. That's all. Thank you for your time. And I hope you enjoy Amira's presentation.
Okay, thank you, Fatima. And now we'll turn it over to Amira.
Thank you. All right, I am going to share my screen. Okay. Oh, goodness. Sorry, for some reason I'm having trouble. There we are. Okay, can everyone see the presentation? Someone give me a thumbs up. Okay, great, thank you. All right, good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me. We're gonna talk today about seed keeping for the African diaspora in the Americas. And seed keeping is the practice of saving seeds along with their stories, their cultural foodways, and the traditions that accompany those seeds. And I'm going to be talking specifically about African-American seed crops and seedways because that's my cultural context. So a little bit about me. As has been said, I'm a farmer, a seed keeper, and a community educator. I have my own seed production farm where I grow heirloom vegetable, herb, and grain seeds from across the African diaspora with a particular focus on African-American, Afro-Caribbean, and West African cultural crops. After this presentation is over, I encourage you to visit my website or to follow me on Instagram to stay posted on some of the things that I am doing on that farm. And if you'd like to visit someday and take a workshop from me in person. All right, so let's begin. Why seed keeping? I want to talk to you guys about why seed keeping is so important, so vital, why projects like this seed library are so important to our communities, to our food systems. And to do that, I'm going to start by giving us a brief history of the global seed industry. It's a little dense, I'll admit, but let's start at the beginning. So starting in 10,000 years before the Common Era, when humans began to save seed from wild plants, we began to domesticate tens of thousands of these crop species, which led to the invention of agriculture as we know it. Fast forward to the 1400s begins the age of discovery, so-called, which is when European nations began to explore and then colonize the rest of the world. And this led to the Columbian Exchange, which was this period of massive biological exchange where plants, animals, and diseases were exchanged between the Americas and the Eastern Hemisphere. And this had huge consequences for our global biodiversity as well as cultural diversity. And it accompanied it accompanied the genocide of many, many people all over the world. Then, of course, starting in 1492 all the way up until the present day, European settlers in the Americas perpetuated genocide against the First Nations peoples of the Americas and displaced many of those who survived. Following that, we have the transatlantic slave trade beginning in the 1500s. And the reason why I'm including these tragic events in our dialogue about the global seed industry is because these processes of colonization are part of the foundations upon which our seed industry was built. And they're part of what we aim to dismantle through the work that we do with seed keeping. In the 1700s through the 1800s began the age of the plant explorers, again, so-called, which was really a very intentional project of biopiracy that was put on as a part of the imperial project of many European countries. And the goal of these projects was to seek out indigenous crops throughout the global South that could potentially be exploited for agricultural and horticultural improvement of the European colonies. So this was a deliberate process of the expansion of European empires, the British Empire in particular, and the founding of the Royal Botanic Gardens in Great Britain was a huge part of this age of plant exploration. Also during this time period, we have a lot of prominent plantation owners and enslavers, which are at this time credited with inventing American agriculture. Though, as I'll talk about later, that so-called invention really took place through the exploitation of both labor and agricultural innovations of the enslaved. So again, it's hard stuff to tackle, but it's important that we understand the basis of how our seed industry was formed, about how agriculture in this country, which had implications for the way that agriculture is practiced globally, really formed its basis. Moving on into the 1900s, saw the end of the United States Free Seed Program, which was founded in 1862. And until that point, the primary purpose of the USDA was to send free seed to farmers. Seeds were completely free. But at this time, the seed industry began to was just building, and it lobbied to end the free seed program. And so in 1924, that free seed program was eliminated. And then that really set the groundwork in the 1930s for the first hybrid seeds to hit the market. Now, as Fatima mentioned, with hybrid varieties, there's nothing necessarily wrong with them, but they make saving seed impractical because the seed won't be true the following year. And this made a system in which a lot of farmers, which normally would save their own seeds, were required to then buy their seed from seed companies year after year, which really disrupted the way that most farmers at the time organized around their own seed saving. Along with the introduction of hybrid seeds came the Green Revolution, which was a project that was bankrolled by Rockefeller and the Ford Foundations, which used the new hybrid seed varieties, which were claimed to be high yielding, along with chemical fertilizers, to promise this green revolution for the global South. And as part of this process, rural communities were encouraged to bring in their traditional seeds and swap them out, exchange these seeds, seeds that had been passed down for generations, and turn them in exchange for these new improved varieties, which of course had to be repurchased every year. And this is one of the first, this is one of the first moments in modern history where we see a large extinction of many unique crop varieties, some of which may not be recoverable. In 1970 through 1994, a series of laws were passed in the United States, including the Plant Variety Protection Act, the goal of which was to allow patents to be placed on seed. And once seed could be patented, it prohibited seed saving, and it prohibited farmers from being able to exchange those seeds. So the very act of going to a seed swap with these new patented varieties was made illegal in this time. And then, of course, this was a prerequisite for the first genetically engineered crops to enter the market, which, of course, were all patented. So as a result of all of this change in the seed system, around the 1990s, we see approximately 40% of farmers throughout the global South have bought into the Green Revolution model. And as a result, the world lost an estimated 75% of its agricultural biodiversity. And along with that, the control of the seeds, to whom the seeds belong and to whom the seeds can be stewarded, it shifted at this time from the hands of farmers to the hands of these corporations, which are in charge now of distributing these new seeds. And so, to cut a very long story short, after this point and continuing on to this day, there's been a series of trade agreements, which have all been to the aim of forcing countries all over the world to create laws that protect plant patents and make seed saving illegal. This has resulted in the cost of seed being quite high and the consolidation of the seed industry. And so now we have very few seed companies that are in charge of sort of the world's global seed supply. So that's a very broad, big picture global look at our seed system. And we're going to bring it back in a moment. But here's an image of what seed system consolidation looks like. This graphic was updated in 2018 to show the consolidation of the seed industry. The red circles are chemical companies, and all the blue circles are the seed companies that they are in ownership of. And so you can see that there's really only 5 players here on the global scale. And we're talking large seed companies right now. We're not talking about, some of the smaller seed catalogs that many of you might be using. But this is what the landscape looks like around the world. And this is just a visualization of the impact that seed industry consolidation has had on the number of varieties that are available to people who want to grow their food. And it's really shrunk quite enormously. And even at the starting point, when I think it's 1903, when they initially tallied these varieties, even then we were at a significantly reduced number of available varieties because of the long history leading up to that point. But then 80 years later, there's very few of these varieties that are left available to people, and even fewer if you're just looking at what's commercially available. And that brings us to the question of, with so few of these seeds around, who is controlling them? Who has the power over the seeds, and thus over our seed systems, over our food systems, over our communities? Who gets to determine which of these varieties continue to survive and which ones we let die out? And so I encourage you to think about that question as we talk about the concept of seed sovereignty. And seed sovereignty is a concept that stands in contrast to this global seed model. It reclaims seeds and biodiversity as commons and public good. That quote is from Vandana Shiva, who's been an advocate for seed sovereignty, especially in India. So what seed sovereignty means, it is the right of a community to self-determine its own agricultural system, including its right to culturally appropriate seed and the right to save, breed, exchange, and sell their own seed. And for me as an African-American, when I think of seed sovereignty, I'm thinking about our right to reclaim a relationship that has become quite fraught as a result of displacement and forced slavery. And it's the right to reclaim our relationship to those seeds, both the right to reclaim the actual seeds that were extracted from our communities, as well as the cultural practices of seed saving that stand in opposition to the modern paradigm of this cycle of consumerism where we're buying seeds every year. It also means the right for us to reclaim our cultural narratives, our stories, our legends, our songs, our diverse ways of understanding our relationship to cultural seeds. And it also means reclaiming the resources that were gained through the economic exploitation of those seeds. But seed sovereignty isn't something that can be given back. One of the great things that a lot of seed libraries are doing now is rematriation, giving seeds back. But sovereignty isn't something that can be given back. It's something for a community to actively reclaim. And I also want to make a note that seed sovereignty should come in concert with land sovereignty. Because the seeds need a place to live and they can't survive in someone's basement or closet. They have to live in the soil. And land loss and forced displacement is one of the major causes of seed loss in a community. So seed sovereignty and land sovereignty are part of this combined concept of sovereignty that is so crucial to repairing our seed system. A big part of that, the cultural sovereignty piece, is the right to tell our own stories. And the narratives around seeds they're a big part of what I do in my work, particularly when it comes to African diasporic seeds. There's a lot of relearning to do around where our seeds come from and the stories and who we attribute these seeds to. In the book, In the Shadow of Slavery, Judith Carney's book, she says, African botanical contributions have been muted because of an reconstructed view that portrayed slaves as little more than the muscles of European ingenuity. And what this means is that the dominant narrative for so long, for many African diasporic crops, was that, they were discovered by, the Europeans and that they were domesticated or somehow, improved as during the process of plantation agriculture. But it's a real distortion of the true story. And if we look to the stories that have been told alongside these seeds, we can find the true history there, which is really important to redefining our relationship to these seeds. Our stories place our seeds within their cultural context and remind us what our seeds mean to us and why we can never let them die, why it's so important to preserve them. And it's really one of the things I always say to people who are looking to save their own seeds, whether they are Black like me or come from any other place in the world, is that no one is going to tell your story the way you can. And no one has a right to your seeds and your stories over you. So always tell your story. When you're sharing your seeds, always share your stories along with your seeds. For African diasporic peoples, our histories, of course, start in West Africa with the many cultures and ethnicities on the continent, and thousands of years of agricultural innovations and developments. And then, of course, they also, for many of us, include forced displacement from our ancestral lands via the Middle Passage. And some of those seeds were able to travel with our ancestors to wherever we ended up in the Americas, and others were left behind. And as a result, our ancestors had to adapt their foodways to a new climate and to new crops. And this resulted in this really unique creolization of African, Indigenous, American, and European foodways that took place in the gardens of the enslaved. So I want to talk about two storytelling archetypes that are told alongside Black seeds. One of those is the braiding seeds story. This is a story that you'll hear told alongside many seeds, African diasporic seeds, particularly with rice, black-eyed peas, and okra. There's a story that goes that when the people knew that they were going to be captured and potentially sold into slavery, they didn't know where they were going to be taken, but they did know that wherever they were going, they would need to eat. And for that, they would need to plant. And for that, they would need seeds. So when their fate became clear, the African grandmothers would braid seeds into the hair of their daughters and their granddaughters and into their own hair before being forced to board the slave ships. And those seeds they carried with them across the Middle Passage to the new lands, and were able to plant in that way by stowing away seeds from their homeland. They were able to take many seeds with them to nourish their descendants for years to come. So this story of braiding seeds in the hair, of hiding them away in the cornrows, is a story that is told by maroon communities throughout the diaspora in both North and South America. So it's a very common one to hear. And it's because of this cultural practice that was upheld. The other story that I will uplift is the botanical gardens of the dispossessed. And that is basically that the food plots of enslaved Africans, because many times in plantation agriculture, enslaved Africans were not given sufficient rations to sustain themselves, but they had a small plot that they were expected to tend in order to feed their families, that they were expected to tend in their free time. And so into these food plots, they grew the crops that they had stowed away, and they grew the crops that they traded with the indigenous populations nearby, and they grew crops that they traded with with indentured Europeans that also worked on the plantations. And through these botanical gardens, these food plots, they created a new diet, which is often characterized as being Southern cuisine. And really generalized in that way. But these botanical gardens form the basis for much of the American agriculture and American cuisine. In fact, a lot of the plantation owners that were said to have discovered a crop discovered it, in fact, in the gardens of the enslaved. And so these gardens tell a story to me that, my enslaved ancestors had agency in their food and in their seeds. And it was one small way for them to create their own space of freedom. Okay. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about the seeds that we keep as part of the African diasporic foodways. And I like to think of the seeds as being of two lineages. There's those that are from the motherland that were stowed away, the ones that came over on slave ships from Africa. And then there are the adopted crops, the crops that replaced a popular plant that was lost in that Middle Passage, that didn't make the journey, and replaced it in the diets of African Americans. And so those adopted crops that came from different indigenous groups in the Americas, or European settler colonizer groups. And so all of these seeds form the basis of what I consider to be African diasporic seeds. So I'll talk a little bit about those. So from the motherland, and this is just a very small selection of crops that I'm talking about, but from the motherland, we have rice, we have okra, we have southern peas, we have watermelon, we have sorghum. Rice. Rice, I wanted to begin with rice because in much of African diasporic cultures throughout the Americas, rice is considered a sacred crop. There are two species of rice. There's the Oryza sativa, which is the Asian rice that we're more commonly familiar with in this day and age. But there's also rice, Oryza glaberrima, and that's a West African rice. That's a rice that was domesticated in West Africa, grown in West Africa for many thousands of years before the transatlantic slave trade. However, until very recently, this rice was thought to have been an Asian rice that was introduced to Africa by the Portuguese. And so part of the story of rice is a story of reclaiming that narrative. And rice has a particular significance for the diaspora because it is one of those crops that is so often said to have crossed the ocean, braided in the hair. And in African diasporic populations that grow both African rice and Asian rice in the diet, it's the African rice that is treated as a sacred crop, as a reminder of the ancestors, and as a reminder of that crossing. So a couple varieties of note. One is the Carolina gold rice, which was one of the most popular rices of the 1800s. And the Carolina gold rice, it's a little disputed whether it is an African rice or an Asian rice species. But it is one of the rices that was stewarded by African peoples and eventually became a very popular commercial rice. And that rice recently came back into the seed, just the seed world where you could purchase it through the work of food historian David Shields and the Carolina Gold Rice Foundation that restored that variety. Another variety I will point out is the Moruga Hill rice, which is not one that's commercially available, but it's a rice that I've personally grown before and loved. And the Moruga Hill rice is a rice that is stewarded by the American population in Trinidad. And their story is that they are descended from Africans that were brought into the Carolinas. And they had formed a Maroon community in the Carolinas, a Gullah Geechee community in the Carolinas. And they had grown this rice there for many generations. Then when I believe it was during the War of 1812, the British offered to relocate any Africans who fought in the war on their side. And so many of the community, this particular Gullah community, joined the war and were relocated to Trinidad. And they carried this rice all the way from South Carolina to Trinidad, just as it had been carried all the way from Africa to South Carolina. And so this is a very special variety of rice that the American community has stewarded for many generations. So if you want to steward rice, you need a minimum population size of 5 to 10 plants in order to get good genetic diversity. And you're gonna want to isolate it by about 10 to 20 feet from any other varieties of rice that you're stewarding. You'll know it's ready for harvest when the rice kernels are, they've turned brown and they are quite dry and firm if you squeeze the individual kernels. So they should look something like the image. And then you can thresh them by harvesting the entire plant from the bottom, and you can kind of bang it against a tarp until the seeds drop from the plants. And then you can winnow it very easily by putting the seeds in one bucket, suspending it above a bucket underneath, and then you can either pour it from the bucket on top to the bucket underneath, either on a windy day or in front of a fan, so that all of the chaff just blows away and the good seed will fall to the bottom. Okra. Okra is probably one of the most quintessential African diasporic crops. It's certainly a polarizing crop for many, but it's so crucial to African cultural cuisine. It's eaten in stews, and it is, I eat it in salads, and it is one of those crops that isn't quite as popular outside of African diasporic communities, at least in this country. It's also popular in Southeast Asia. But okra, a couple varieties of note are the Clemson spineless okra, which is just, it's the okra that's pictured here. It's just a common green okra variety, but it's a very historic variety. And then the Sea Island red okra is, it looks similar, but it's a very deep red color. And it is a Gullah Geechee variety. So it's been stewarded by the Gullah Geechee community. To steward okra for seed, you need a minimum population of 5 to 10 plants and isolate it at least 500 feet from any other okras that you're growing. When you're harvesting it to eat, you clip the pods from the stem using pruners or a knife or something when they're quite small and tender, no more than 4 inches usually. But when you're harvesting them for seed, you let the pods get really, really big. They'll get quite woody. And when they're completely dry, you can clip them from the plant, and then you can just crack them open really easily to remove the seeds from the rest of the pod. Next up are southern peas, which are also called field peas or cow peas or black-eyed peas or Crowder peas. They have many names. They're one of my favorite crops to grow. And they're exceptionally easy for a newbie to seed saving. A couple of particular varieties. I am stewarding right now the Azelle family fisheye pea, which is a variety that they can trace back all the way from West Africa to the multiple relocations that their family has had to take as they were relocated from a plantation in Mississippi to one in Louisiana. And so the Azelle family pea is a very common looking black-eyed pea. And then there's also the Sea Island red pea, which is pictured here, which is a Gullah Geechee variety and very special and very tender. If you are growing southern peas for seed, make sure to have a minimum population of at least 10 plants and isolate it from your next crop, but from 10 to 20 feet. So you will harvest them for seed at the same time you harvest them for eating as a dry bean. So when the pods have turned brown and they're very crispy, you can pluck them from the plant, and they're quite easy to shell by hand. Watermelon. Watermelon is a very complicated crop, I think, for many African Americans. And the reason why watermelon is so complicated is because of the years that it has been used as a racist symbol, as a stereotypical, part of the stereotypical image that was weaponized against Black folks to portray African descended peoples as being lazy and childlike and all kinds of negative things. But watermelon is a really important crop in the diaspora. It of course comes from Sudan, is where it originates. And it was really important crop in the enslaved garden because it provided water and nutrients on hot, hard days. And then after emancipation, during the Reconstruction period, watermelon was one of the primary crops that Black farmers used as an income generator on their farms. Because watermelon was one of the crops that Black people were able to kind of get a monopoly of in the South. And there were, trucks that would ship the watermelon from South to the North. And they were able to really create this big market for watermelon that was so successful and so lucrative for Black farmers during the Reconstruction that there was a deliberate attempt to undermine the sales of watermelon for these Black farmers. And that's when the racist stereotype was born. It was born as part of, as part of the Jim Crow minstrel jingles in order to undermine the economic success that Black farmers had found by cultivating watermelon. So it's a very important crop for me to reclaim. And in my research into watermelon, it's been very difficult for me to identify varieties of watermelon that were recorded and explicitly stated to have been stewarded by Black farmers during Reconstruction. I haven't been able to find good research on that for most watermelon varieties. However, there is this one that I found called the Odell's White Watermelon. This is the only watermelon that I found to date that is known to have been bred by an African-American man. It was bred by an enslaved African man. It was not named after him. It was named after Milton Odell, who used that watermelon to win some watermelon contest. But it is the only variety where the breeding of the watermelon was actually attributed to an enslaved African man. It is not the only watermelon that was bred by an African American person, but it's the only one where there is concrete evidence to support that. So it's a really important one, and it's quite delicious. It's a very pale rind, which is why it's called white, and the flesh inside is more of a pink than a red, and it's so refreshing. It's super refreshing, and the seeds are super edible, unlike many watermelon with the harder seeds. Anyway, if you want to grow watermelon for seed, a minimum population of, I would say 10 plants is a good idea, and you're going to want to isolate it with as much room as you can possibly give it. If you can, 800 feet to half a mile from the next watermelon crop. Harvesting watermelon for seed is extremely easy. You harvest it when it's ripe for eating. So when it has that nice yellow spot and it makes that good drum noise when you tap it, you just cut it open, you eat it, and you spit out the seeds. It could not be simpler or more pleasurable. And then lastly for this section, we'll talk a little bit about sorghum. And sorghum is a crop that's less commonly known up here in the North, but in the South, it's been used primarily as a sugar crop. It is sugarcane-like, but unlike sugarcane, it does not have to be grown in the very, very deep South. It can be grown here. It can be grown throughout most of the states. But it, of course, originates in Africa, where it was used not only as a sweetener, but also as a grain and to make various alcoholic beverages. So a couple of varieties. The black amber cane sorghum is one of the oldest varieties that entered the US from Africa, and the white African sorghum is another one of those varieties. The white African sorghum more commonly used for grain, the black amber more commonly used for syrup, but they're both important historic varieties. A minimum population of 10 to 25 plants, isolated about 100 feet from your next sorghum crop. And then you harvest it when the seed heads are nice and dry. And if the plants are very tall, mine grew 10 feet tall last year. And so I had to kind of bend them over a little bit to check, but they kind of change color from like a green to like a reddish or browner, depending on the variety. And then you can test the seeds with your fingernail and they should not dent. And that's how you know that they're ready. And then you can just cut it down And then you can thresh it the same way you do for rice by kind of just whacking it against a tarp or inside of a bucket, or you can kind of like rub it through your hands to remove the seeds, and then you blow off the excess plant material using the wind or a fan. Okay, so now let's talk about adopted crops. Again, the crops which do not originate in the continent of Africa, but have been adopted by African diasporic communities for one reason or another, often to replace a much loved crop that was left behind. So peanuts. Peanuts they originate in South America. And this is a crop that was said to be introduced to West Africa via the Portuguese. But it was introduced prior to the transatlantic slave trade and adopted into the diets of West Africans for a period of time before the transatlantic slave trade. And so the peanuts were actually introduced to North America via slave ships coming from Africa. And so the first varieties to enter the United States were these varieties, African varieties of peanuts grown in the food plots of the enslaved. The peanuts, they grow underground and they're a legume. And this made them very, very similar to a native African crop, the groundnuts. And so because they're so very productive, they ended up replacing the native groundnut in groundnut soup, if you've ever had that. And so that's why they became so popular in Africa and then again in the Americas. The Carolina African Runner was one of the first peanuts to come over. And so that's a very exciting historic variety to steward. You want at least 5 plants isolated to about 10 feet from the next crop over. You'll know it's ready for harvest because you want to plant it as early as you can in the season. And then the above ground plant is just going to die at some point, you know, especially in a more northern climate where at some point it gets too cold and the above ground part of the plant dies. And that's when you dig the whole plant up. You just kind of like shake off the dirt and most of the good peanuts are going to fall right off, and you know, you can just shell them to plant. Corn. Corn is such an important crop in the diaspora. I grew up eating cornbread that my grandma made, and it's just one of those plants that's very, very crucial. It also has its origin in Central America and made its way over to Africa before the transatlantic slave trade, but it also was introduced into African diasporic cuisine through interactions with indigenous people in the Americas, and then became a popular substitute where sorghum was not available to make a lot of the traditional grains and breads that sorghum could be used to make. You want a minimum population for corn of 50 to 100 plants. It really is a difficult one to save seed from if you don't have the room. It also requires a lot of distance, 800 feet to a half mile from the next plant over. This is especially true if you are working with genetically modified corn. You really want a large distance away from that to prevent crossing. If you're not near genetically modified corn, you could maybe get away with like 600 feet from the next corn over. It's pretty easy to harvest for seed as long as you get it before the squirrels do. You simply remove the ears when the kernels are hard, and then you just shuck it, you shell it. It's good old corn seed. Okay, next up is amaranth. And there are actually amaranth species in the Americas as well as there are also West African amaranth species. And so the American amaranths replaced the West African amaranths in the diets of African diasporic peoples in the Americas. And so if you've ever heard of callaloo, that is a dish that's made with a leaf amaranth, and it's very popular in the Caribbean. So for amaranth, you want a minimum population of at least 5 plants. And you do want to give it quite a big isolation distance. The pollen is really light and can really travel. So at least 600 feet. You'll know it's ready to harvest per seed because the flowers will likely not look very different. So you'll have to check it often when the flower starts to dry up a bit. So what I like to do is I just bend over the plant and you just kind of lightly tap the flower into your hand. Just tap, tap, tap it into your hand. And when the seed spills out from the flower into your hand, that's when you know it's ready. It's called shattering. So at that point, you'll just want to cut down the plants and then you'll thresh and winnow the same way as with any grain, where you just, you kind of beat the plants a little bit to remove the seeds, and then you let the wind take care of all of the excess chaff. Okay, squash. Squash is another crop that comes from Central America originally. Of course, it is spread throughout the Americas. And for enslaved Africans, it replaced a lot of the gourds that are traditionally eaten and native to Africa. And these gourds were eaten not just for their flesh, but also the leaves are eaten for a lot of African gourds. And so, my grandma would tell me, you eat the leaves, you eat the flowers, and then you eat the fruit. It's a completely edible crop. A couple of varieties to note, the green striped cushaw squash, which time allowing, I will talk about a little bit later. And also the calabaza pumpkin, which is also known as the Jamaican pumpkin or the Haitian pumpkin, very popular in the Caribbean. So for this, you want to give it a minimum population size of 5, I would really say more like 10 plants, and isolate it as much as possible. 800 feet is really, ideal. You can harvest a squash for seed, even a summer squash, any kind of squash, when the stem is completely dry. You just wait for that stem to go brown and dry, and then you can clip it from the stem, and then you can either cure it or you could harvest it immediately for the seed and just remove the seeds from the flesh, and then you can go ahead and make a pie with whatever's left over. Collards and cabbage, one of my favorite plants. So collards and cabbage actually come from the Mediterranean originally, and they were part of a collection of greens known as coleworts. And so they were brought to the Americas by like very poor British settlers. And they were not really very popular though in European cuisine. They were considered, a poverty food, something that was you ate in the winter when nothing else nutritious was around. They were not a popular food. However, the introduction of coleworts through the hands of enslaved Africans became American collards, which were they're essentially a new crop that was developed by Africans in the Americas. And became a winter-long green. A couple varieties to note. I will just call out, I think, the William Alexander Heading collard, which is one that is not widely available yet, but will be soon. It was one of the varieties that was part of the Heirloom Collards Project, which I encourage you to look up if you love collards. The Heirloom Collards Project was an initiative by a group of seed stewards that went back to the USDA and sourced a bunch of seed from a research project that had occurred 20 years prior to identify unique collard varieties that were growing in people's backyards throughout the South. And the William Alexander Heading collard was one that was developed by an African-American man in North Carolina for, at least a decade. And one of the things that was unique about it is that a Heading collard produces like a mini cabbage, and then you can harvest the cabbage, and then you can harvest the collards after you've harvested the cabbage. So for collards as well as cabbage, you need at least 20, I would say more like 50 plants for good seed, You have to isolate them by 800 feet to half a mile, but that's not incredibly difficult because they are biennials. So unlike most of the other plants I've already talked about, they flower in their second year rather than in their first year. So as long as you don't have two collards that are flowering at the same time, you don't really have to worry about that distance, but you do have to have them in your garden for quite a while before they'll set seed. And so then they'll put up these big stalks with a bunch of little pods. And when those pods are brown and dry and crispy, you can remove the stalks and then thresh and winnow the seeds. Tomatoes originate in South America. A couple important varieties are the Aunt Lou's Underground Railroad tomato, which was said to have been given to Aunt Lou by an African-American who was escaping enslavement. The Plat de Haiti tomato is another important one from the Caribbean, which was brought into North America after the Haitian Revolution. For tomatoes, you want to have at least 5 to 10 plants, and between 10 to 50 feet of tomatoes, depending on basically how big the flower is. You want to give them a little bit more if they've got an exceptionally large, we call them promiscuous flowers. So for seed, you harvest it when the tomato is perfectly ripe, even a little bit getting overripe. So it's nice and it's juicy and plump and maybe a little bit soft. To clean these seeds, they actually require a little bit of an extra step. You remove the seeds from the tomato and then you have to allow them to ferment. And you do this by taking all those seeds in the pulp and you put them in like a mason jar or a bucket or something. You add just enough water to cover it. You put a paper towel or a cloth over it and you just let it sit for 1 to 3 days. When it's finished fermenting, you'll know because the seeds will have sunk to the bottom, and then you can just pour off all the gunk and the immature seeds that are floating on top, and then strain them and dry them, and you have good tomato seed. Peppers. Peppers are incredibly important throughout the African diaspora, particularly many hot peppers. Scotch bonnet peppers are very important in the Caribbean. Up here in the north, we have the Horace Pippin Pepper Collection, which is a collection of multiple pepper varieties that were saved by the African-American painter Horace Pippin. He collected these peppers by visiting African-American owned restaurants throughout the Mid-Atlantic region and just asking if he could take the seeds. And so we have fish peppers and buena mulata peppers and pepper pot peppers and all kinds of peppers in that collection. To save pepper seed, you need at least 5 to 20 plants. I would say you can give them at least 100 feet from your next pepper. Very hard to choose which peppers to plant for me. So I at least give them 100 feet, ideally, at least 300 feet. You harvest them when they're perfectly ripe. So when they've changed color to whatever that mature color is, and then you can just carefully, if they're hot, remove the seeds from the fruit and let them dry. So now that we've talked a lot about different African diasporic crops that you can save in your garden, I wanted to talk to you guys about building community seed sovereignty. So not just saving seed for yourself, but how do we strengthen our community's resilience and ability to save seeds? And part of how we can do that is through community gardens. Seed saving community gardens can be complicated because of the distances that you need between different crops. However, if you work with the other members of your community garden, you can collaborate to preserve a particular variety. Say you all plant the same pepper for 1 year, just so you can save that variety. It's also a great way to create your own varieties. If you all have different okras that you're growing and you just want to create something new, to let them all cross and get a unique okra that's special for your garden. But collaboration in community gardens is a great way to build and strengthen your community seed sovereignty. Another great way is if you have a lot to do in your garden, or maybe you have a farm, invite your community out to help with planting, with harvesting, with seed cleaning. So much seed cleaning that I've done on the farms that I've worked has happened because we all, you know, we laid out our plant material on a tarp and we all just kind of danced on it to separate the seeds from the plants. Or we all had our hands over a bucket as we shelled okra or black-eyed peas. And this is a really great way to build that connection with each other and to share our stories, as well as we share in the joy of our seeds. Seed swaps are a great way as well. Seed swaps are just when you exchange swaps. So they can happen on an individual level, just with exchanging seeds with your neighbor, or they can happen as part of a community event. Just anytime you are swapping seeds, make sure that you're also sharing those stories. Make sure that that seed swap is also a story swap. And then lastly, but certainly not least, of course, we have seed libraries, which are so foundational to the community seed sovereignty process. Seed libraries, of course, like the Providence Seed Library. So as I wrap up, I just wanted to leave you guys with a more personal story. And this is the story of my great-grandfather's green-striped cushaw squash. So my family, I grew up in Massachusetts, and my family, one side comes from Southern Georgia and the other side comes from North Carolina. But I'm the first person in my family in multiple generations to be a farmer, to return to the land. And that's because there's been a lot of intergenerational trauma, and so many people in my family just did not want to associate with land-based work, with farming of any kind, because it held so much trauma for them. And so I grew up, in the city, in Boston, with really no concept of how connected my family was to the land, besides, my grandmother's stories of growing up, picking cotton in Georgia. That was really my only personal link. But as I started to get into farming, when I was a teenager, it was my first ever summer job. As I started to get into farming, I started looking for that connection, that ancestral connection to my farming practice, to really ground my farming work in something that wasn't so marred by trauma. And as I became a seed keeper and started working more with seed farming, I started to look into, what varieties are, connected to my ancestry. I started looking into some African diasporic varieties. I was reading Michael Twitty's blog one day, and I stumbled across an article about this green-striped cushaw squash. And it said, he said that, this squash is one that was grown by enslaved Africans in North Carolina, primarily. It's originally from the Caribbean, and it was brought into North Carolina by slaves that passed through the Caribbean as part of that slave trade, and traded with the local indigenous population for this squash, that they brought these seeds back to the Carolinas and began to grow them in their gardens. And I gravitated towards the squash because it was from North Carolina, where one half of my family is from. And so I grew out that squash. It was the first ever crop that I was growing intentionally as a seed crop, just solely for the joy of saving a seed. And so I grew it out. And then later that year, in October, in the fall, my grandmother passed away. And this was a really, it was a really significant moment in my life, and in my family, and it was a significant moment in my family, so much more so because she was such a keeper of the family traditions, and she was the person who brought us all together. We all went to her house for Thanksgiving. She made all the food. She was really the keeper of these recipes that brought us all together. And so when we went to celebrate her life, it was the first time in a while that I was seeing a good part of that side of my family. And of course, because we were talking about Grandma Patty Bird, we started talking about food. So much talk about food, about her favorite foods, what we loved. And that's when I found out from talking to my grandmother's sister, my great aunt, that the green striped cushaw squash was something that my great grandfather used to grow in his garden. I had no idea that my grandmother had grown up with a garden in her backyard, and that my great grandfather used to grow much of what they grew up eating. It was my first time hearing those stories. And so my Aunt Maddie was describing what this squash looks like and what it tasted like. And I said, hang on, is it this squash? And I showed her a picture, and that's the squash that I grew, without knowing how personal that connection was for me. And so come November, Thanksgiving rolls around. And for some reason this year, November, the date of Thanksgiving that year is the exact date that would have been my late grandmother's birthday. Their birthdays are, her birthday was always around that time. And so I went to visit my great aunt for Thanksgiving, and I brought pies that I had made with the squash. And I just put them on the table just with all the other pies and desserts that people had brought. And then sometime late into the evening, my great aunt had taken a bite of the pie, and she paused and she said, "Who made this?" And I stood up, and she summoned me to her side, and she said, "What did you make this of?" And I told her it was the green striped cushaw squash that you told me about. I grew it and I made a pie. And she said, "It tastes exactly like my childhood. It tastes exactly how I remember it." And she, at that point, made everyone in the family try a piece of this pie, and told us about, how she remembered her father, my great grandfather, and this pie and this squash. And at that point, she charged me with always being the one to bring the squash pie every Thanksgiving. And I took that as a personal call to keep these seeds alive as well, and make sure that I continue to tell this story so that we didn't lose our connection to the squash again, as we nearly did. So that's a big part of why I do this work, why I save seeds, why I save seed stories. And so I wanted to leave you with this. We keep seeds to honor our ancestors, both plant and human, whose stories we carry in our bodies. We keep seeds to liberate our cultural identities from their historic exploitation by racial capitalism. We keep seeds to grow the food that nourishes ourselves, our families, and communities. We keep seeds to pass on to our descendants so they may live in abundance and carry our stories into the future. Thank you.
Amira, that was incredible. Thank you so, so much, especially for sharing that story. So we have some time for questions. We did run a bit over, and we do need to end the program by 8, but I think there was, if anybody wants to unmute, Summer, you had a question, if you wanted to unmute and ask it. Mira, I don't know if you're seeing the chat, but you are phenomenal. Thank you for sharing. Amazing.
Thank you so much. I did want to just share a couple of my sources, because I'm a farmer. I'm not actually a historian, so I had to do some research. So a couple of sources. In the Shadow of Slavery, Africa's Botanical Legacy in the Atlantic World by Judith Carney and Richard Razumoff. I highly recommend this book if you are interested in African diasporic food. If you're interested more in just sort of like practical seed saving, I couldn't really go into that much depth with the time we had, but I recommend The Seed Garden, this book by the Seed Savers Exchange. And then if you want a book that does a little bit of both, then pick up this one, Farming While Black by Leah Penniman.
All right, Summer, I think you're unmuted.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Awesome. Yeah, hi, Amir. This is an awesome presentation. I especially love the breeding seed story. It's super incredible. I was wondering, how do we get connected with community groups that do like seed saving and like growing and stuff?
Oh, that's a great question. It depends on where you are. I know that the Providence Library is probably a good place to start if you're near there. But it depends on where you are. They do exist.
All right, I'm in Providence, so I'll definitely start there.
Where are you?
In Providence.
Oh, great. So I imagine that you can get involved with the Seed Library project that Fatima introduced us to. Also, you can go to the Seed Savers Exchange website where they have a lot of initiatives that you can get involved with there, and have a sort of like virtual seed swap area as well.
Awesome.
Also, maybe just talk to your neighbors and your family, and you could start your own little project.
Okay, awesome. Thanks.
Any other questions?
Ooh, okay. Seeing the chat.
Yeah, I don't see any other questions in the chat. So, wait a minute. Someone did raise their hand. Is it Nikisha? Are you able to unmute?
Yes, good evening. Thank you. Thank you, Amira. It just gave me flashbacks of my family and honoring our ancestors. This was so awesome. Thank you all for putting this together as well. I did want to ask if you would, if it was possible for you to just put up your contact information again.
Sure.
It was on your last slide, I think.
I'll also put it in the chat.
Oh, okay.
Why don't I just do that? Because
yeah, that'd be awesome. Thank you.
If you go to my website, I have a contact page. So if you have a question, you can always go to the website and contact me there. And then I'm on Instagram.
Okay, I see two more questions. So Kelsey, if you wanted to ask your question.
Okay.
Yeah, first of all, thanks. This was a really cool presentation. I was wondering, when you were talking about squashes grown for greens, I'm familiar with some folks who are growing for greens, and I'm just curious, can you do that with any variety or are there only certain varieties that works well for?
For squashes? Yeah, you can do that with any variety of squash. And part of the African tradition is to eat the greens of almost everything in the garden has a green that's edible. So, you know, the southern peas, the greens on those will also be eaten and added to the pot with all the rest. There's so many greens that I didn't get to touch on in this presentation. Okra, you can eat the leaves. There's so many things. You just have to cook them right, you know?
All right, cool. Thank you.
Someone asked.
Yeah, Christine had a question.
Yeah, that's a great question. And if you want a more in-depth presentation on the nitty-gritty of seed saving, I do offer workshops that really go in depth on seed saving. And so you could look at my Instagram to see when the next one is for that. But in a nutshell, the reason there is a minimum population for saving good seed is because of genetic diversity. So depending on how a plant is used to being pollinated, whether it is wind pollinated as corn is, or insect pollinated the way squashes are, or if it is self-pollinated the way like lettuce and most tomatoes are, that will affect how many plants you need to have in a population to prevent inbreeding. And if you have too few, we know that having too few plants to cross with can lead to inbreeding. And down the line, after multiple generations of inbreeding, after inbreeding happens, the crops will begin to lose their vigor and underperform and become sickly and weak. And so we want our seeds to be healthy for many generations to come. And that's why there's a minimum population.
Okay, so we are just about at 8 o'clock. I just want to say thank you again, Amira. That was such an incredible presentation. From the whole Seedlings crew, thank you, thank you, thank you to Amira and to everybody who joined us tonight. Next week's program is Thursday, March 3rd, also on Zoom at 6:30 p.m. And it's the second in Sue Scotty's series on seed starting. And so we'll be talking about tips and tricks for direct sowing and transplanting the seedlings into our outdoor vegetable gardens, including timing, spacing, watering, and more. Lee just put the registration link in the chat. So please join us if you can. And remember, if you miss a program or would like to watch this one a second time, like I will be, check out the YouTube channel for Providence Community Library. And so that's it. Thank you all so much and take care.